Perfect.
Awesome. All right. Thank you for, coming to chit chat with me, Danny.
Awesome. I'm really glad to be here with you, Zoe.
So, I got really excited when you commented on my all call Twitter shout out thingy saying, "Hey, who wants to come on my little podcast Zoom thing and talk about faith?" And you commented really excitedly about Taylor Swift and how that can be brought into faith, which is also so timely considering how that kind of like broke Twitter a couple months ago.
A little bit. Little bit.
So,
So it's
yeah,
really funny because I was not born and bred a Swiftie. I am a little bit older than Taylor. And so I was already in my late college years when Taylor Swift really came out with her first album. So I was an NFL fan, not even a Kansas City Chiefs fan. And I had a group of young adults in my congregation in California who were really into Taylor Swift. And so when the Eras tour got announced, they were so excited. And then that first summer of the Eras tour, all these rumors came out about Taylor Swift might be dating some guy who plays a sport. You speak sports, Danny. Is this dude good at the sports? Which turned into me educating a couple of my young adults for my congregation about football, and that yes, Travis Kelce is very good at his job. His job is move people out of the way and catch football. Uh, Sometimes it's also look ridiculous while doing so, and occasionally is throw football to other person so that it goes better. Uh, but from there, it became, well, if you're teaching us about football, we want to teach you about Taylor Swift. So I went to the Eras Tour movie. I went to an Eras Tour dance party. I pre-ordered my Tortured Poets department. And then somewhere along the way, I discovered I had been fully converted into being a Swiftie. And from there, it became how do I incorporate something that's very meaningful to my young adults into how I do ministry at my congregation?
that is so cool.
So, yeah, I was really excited because I'm like, huh, I am working on this project actively.
So, how's that coming along?
So what I actually do is I have a history in education. This is actually my second career. I was a
That's
public school
perfect.
teacher. I grew up Methodist. I grew up in the United Methodist Church.
Oh,
Um, but I grew up in a more conservative part of the Methodist Church that I had friends who weren't allowed to listen to secular music. I had friends who weren't allowed to go to anything that wasn't a PG or G-rated movie. My parents were not like that. I had a lot more freedom to listen to things. I got in trouble in kindergarten for singing Rod Stewart's Hot Legs. And then 2 weeks later, got in trouble for singing Def Leppard's Pour Some Sugar on Me. To which my kindergarten teacher informed both myself and my mother that they were not kindergarten appropriate songs. One was my mother's fault, one was my uncle's fault. But so I have never lived in a world where secular music, secular books, anything like that wasn't allowed.
hmm.
And I switched into doing youth and family ministry, children and youth ministry about 15 years ago. I left teaching and moved into working in churches. And from there, I discovered that if I can figure out how to connect the things that my kids or my young adults are experiencing in their outside of church life to we're talking about in church, um,
Hmm.
I can relate to them better. We can tie it into similar things that are going on in the Bible. So when we were talking about the Eras tour and the music, as it was coming out last year, we started talking about the women of the Bible and what eras do they belong in, what would be on their Spotify playlist. We had really just great discussions about the stories of the women. Uh,
Hmm.
Taylor doesn't just tell stories about herself, she does it beautifully, but she also chooses to tell stories about other people. And depending whether or not in the folklore universe you've decided it's fact or fiction, um, she weaves in beautiful storytelling elements that include stories of others or stories that could be about others. And we get in the Bible, so much of it focuses on the male perspective
Hmm.
that oftentimes the women of the Bible are the others. And so it started with a discussion about how, if we're talking about the love triangle in folklore, who would I equate that to be in the Bible? And from there, it turned into a discussion of Leah and Rachel and how neither Leah or Rachel are the antagonists in their storyline. They're taken advantage of by their own father, who chooses to betray both of them and put them into a terrible situation. Because at the point of time, they were property, they have no say in the matter. Um, and when we look at the very specific love triangle in folklore, we realize that neither of the two teenage girls chose to be in that situation. They were put into that situation through the circumstances that are surrounding them. Neither of them chose to be the villain in somebody else's story.
Mm.
So that talked about really who is the villain in the story of Leah and Rachel. Ultimately, it's their father who chose to deceive everyone. But we don't talk about that.
Hmm.
So that developed into a really great discussion about how do we talk about people who are perceived as the bad guy in church history and whether or not they really were the bad guy. It brought up some really interesting discussions about the early foundation of the Church of England and how Anne Boleyn wound up in a relationship with King Henry that resulted in the formation of a whole different denomination.
Right, that French girl.
But it wasn't her choice necessarily. She
Hmm.
was 15 when she was being pursued
What?
and not like when you are being chosen by someone in a leadership position, you don't get the opportunity to say no. And so it talked about how when we look at how so much of history and much like the Bible is written by men, we get the perspectives of people being villainized who aren't a villain. So we talked about that through the lens of folklore and a little bit with Evermore, but mostly the folklore kind of narrative of how the stories go, which was really fun to get to talk about. And that actually led itself to me outlining writing a book about the eras of the women in the Bible, which eventually will get written somewhere. And Taylor had to go and throw another album out there. And I'm still really waiting for Reputation to be re-released because I refuse to work on that chapter until I have the re-record because I will not listen to it if it's not her music. Because I am one of those people.
Makes sense.
But it was a lot of fun to get to like start to build this. If you want
Hmm.
me to screen share, I actually have some of the Spotify playlists.
Yes.
If you want to see them, I can share them with you. Because I did it a little bit backwards where I started with some of like the components that would put in chapters and built that out before I started like doing the actual writing. And there's a lot of research involved.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
But yeah, if you want to let me screen share, I
Yeah,
can
yeah,
show you the
I just
Spotify.
changed it.
Perfect. I just have to remember how to. There we go. So now you get to see I have Sarah, I have Rahab, I have Esther, and I have Miriam's playlist.
Oh, I love
And
that.
They're all equated to different chapters. Those are clearly the chapters I've started with. Um, so for example, I'll just pick Miriam's. So Miriam is in her fearless era.
Mm.
The entire exodus out of Egypt hinges upon Miriam being fearless in approaching Pharaoh's daughter and saying, "Hey, you should keep this baby." She really becomes that foundation. So when we look at like her playlist, it's very much some of those foundational tracks behind Fearless. We get Breathe, we get Bye Bye Baby, because it's ultimately a story about a baby. We get Tell Me Why, we get Try from Colby Calais, we get Lucky from Jason Mraz, and then we get Little Things from One Direction. And those are songs that I think 12-year-old Miriam would have been bopping around to, watching her little brother careening down a river in a basket. Because she ultimately tries to live out of radical positivity. She's fearless in that she sees what could be and she doesn't
Hmm.
hesitate. And in that fearless era, we get that like seeing what can be and that just kind of, I'm going to just embrace life. Then we get into kind of the darker bits of
Mm.
where not everything is perfect, not everything's great, which gets us into Speak Now.
Mm.
Esther ultimately is a Speak Now girly. Esther saves her people by speaking up. So we get Speak Now mean because Esther's really going, why can't I be so mean? We get Castles crumbling because her entire world is falling down. We get
Hmm.
I Can See You because Esther sees what's really going on. Then we get into the foundational people who were around encouraging Taylor when she was in some pretty dark times. Um, Kelly Clarkson encouraged her to re-record her albums. Pink
Mm.
and Christina Aguilera were the people who immediately came to her defense during the VMAs, as did Kelly Clarkson. So we get this is a little bit longer playlist, but we get Respect from Pink, we get Save You from Kelly Clarkson, Empty Words from Christina Aguilera, Some Kind of Miracle from Kelly Clarkson, because in the end of the story, that's what it takes is some kind of miracle. It's Not Right by Catherine McPhee, because we got to, throw it back to a little bit of a one-hit wonder. And then we get Whatever Will Be from Vanessa Hudgens.
Mm.
Most of these artists had big hits right around the same time that Speak Now came out. And so these would have been songs that would have been in the same kind of radio mix that Taylor's songs would have popped up on. And so if we think of Esther kind of living cloistered in her rooms in the king's house, this is what would be playing on her radio as she's kind of being held captive, and realizes that she's probably the only way her people are going to be safe is if she speaks up. So that's kind of where it started from. And now I'm just kind of continuing along that road.
I love that. Do you have any ideas for Deborah?
So I have Deborah and JL as Evermore.
Oh.
And the reason why is if folklore is kind of that happy go lucky fantasy realm, Evermore is the other side of that coin. It's
Mm.
the reality. And reality isn't always very pretty, including sometimes you got to drive a tent peg through someone's skull.
Y-
But we get two women who are stuck in a reality that oftentimes isn't very pretty. They're stuck in a time and place where a lot of other people have goofed up around them, and they're stuck cleaning up other people's messes. So a little bit of that and Evermore. Definitely Champagne Problems.
That sounds very fitting.
Uh, Definitely a little bit inspired for picking the women that fit in that was 100% because Problems is in fact my favorite Taylor Swift song.
Wow.
Um, which is a super unpopular choice. Um, However, Evermore is also my most played album, and which absolutely floored my Swiftie young adults when they were like, "Here are the albums, please listen." Um, when they're like, "Okay, which album is your most listened to on your like Spotify tracking app?" And I said, "Evermore," and they gasped. They were like, "Oh, why?" And I'm like, "Because I really like Champagne Problems and Exile, and apparently not songs that I'm supposed to like." But those are kind of the darker side of life stories. Now, this is how far down the Swifty rabbit hole I have been in only a year and a half. There's a chapter for Karma, the Lost album. It is from the Apocrypha, which not every denomination views as canonical literature. Not everyone views Karma as a canonical Taylor Swift album. Will they, won't they? Will they, won't they? So,
That is beautiful.
Karma is the story of Judith. So, that's one that I'm doing a little bit of research right now on kind of why we don't include this in many of our Bibles. What does the story offer to the people of God as far as our history and faith? What can we learn from this book? Why don't we consider it canon? Why do some people consider it canon? And then talking about is the Karma album something that could have been that turned into something else? Is Karma the album ultimately a lost project that we will never actually find out what could have been? Or is Karma inevitably an album that wound up being split up between other projects?
Mm.
That it was a specific time and phase of life that wound up being woven into other projects. Because we get components of the story of Judith that are very similar to other parts of the Bible that you're like, oh, well, when they were editing, they're like, well, this is a little repetitive. So
And then
maybe
we
we
have
just
kings.
cut it out. Um, and so when we look at stuff like that, um, that's kind of how the other ones went in. Now, I do have the one that's being hotly debated right now, which is who belongs in the tortured poets department.
Ah.
And so ultimately, if we're looking at the tortured poets department being the response to the Lover album,
Mm.
we have the Lover album being the greatest love story ever told through song, which in our Bible is the Song of Solomon, because, well, it's bringing sexy back. But we have to look at a often romanticized but really isn't love story for that opposite. We get the story of David and Bathsheba. It is a Bible story that certain faith communities oftentimes like to romanticize. They like to skip over portions of that story that are not palatable.
I did not know that.
They skirt on by the fact that King David literally has Bathsheba's husband killed so that he can have her. And when we look at kind of that story the tortured poets department tells, we're looking at someone who is being mistreated for the sake of someone else getting to have a good time. And so it lent itself really to Bathsheba, who had no say in the
Hmm.
matter. The woman just wanted to take a bath. Like, and so when you look at like the imagery and the story of like, I can do it with a broken heart. Bathsheba gets stuck in a really crummy situation and she figures it out. And she's
Hmm.
doing it with a broken heart. She has no choice. So she is making the best out of where she's been put. So yeah, that's the Eras Tour and the Women of the Bible, a project that is still ongoing. Because I swear, if she drops rep tomorrow, I'm not a 1018 believer. I'm not a 1018 believer. But once rep drops, that might change things. Because when you unlock vault tracks, sometimes you get an album that's radically different than what it used to be.
Mm.
But yeah, so I continue to do a lot of kind of pop culture stuff with my kids.
Hmm.
So, like this last Wednesday, we talked about the room of requirement from the Harry Potter books and how we've got scripture that talks about my father's house, there are many rooms. And are those rooms like the room of requirement? Like, do we know what these rooms are? We don't know. We got nothing. Um, so then we did a scavenger hunt of stuff that was in our youth room and figured out like what's in our room where we spend the bulk of our time on Sundays and Wednesdays. Why is this stuff here? Why is some of it just being stored in our closet because we don't have any other place for it? Versus what are the things that we are actively, constantly using and abusing in our youth room? Which prompted them to remind me that I haven't restocked their refrigerator. So that's a Saturday project is to go buy the children drinks because they only have 3 cans of sparkling water.
Those monsters.
We did a big youth trip to New Orleans this year with our denomination.
Wow.
So like 17,000 Lutheran youth were down in New Orleans for about a week. We took over the arena the Pelicans play in. We got to be in the city before Taylor,
Oh.
of which 2 of my freshman girls, had to take pictures outside the Superdome, be like, Taylor's gonna be here. Um, and so we spent a week down there. But one of the things that we talked about is how the music of the city greatly has influenced their faith community. And then we talked about how different kinds of music were featured throughout our worship services during the week and how some of
Mm.
them were directly influenced by the city, were directly influenced by different speakers. Um, we had some Afro-Cuban music one night, which was really fun because most of my kids had never heard that. Um,
Hmm.
so we had a really good time with that. But 2 summers ago, 2 summers ago, I had a congregation that kept asking me why I talked about this little TV show called Ted Lasso so much. I said, because it's a really great show. And they're like, well, we want an excuse to like watch it. So, like, will you write a Bible study series for it? And we'll do it as our summer Bible study. So, every Wednesday through the summer of 2023, I hosted a 10-week series on Ted Lasso and the Bible. And we used solely the book of Romans. And
Hmm.
we did 10 episodes throughout the 3 seasons of Ted Lasso and looked at specific Roman scripture that fit each of those selected 10 episodes. It was supposed to be an 8-week series, and they conned me into 2 extras. When you have 25 retirees who are like, I had a woman who came with her walker and her adorable emotional support animal every week. It's adorable. Loved
Oh
it.
my goodness.
But they had heard about Ted Lasso or other people had talked to them about it, but all they knew is that it was rated M for language on their TV. And so they're like, can't be a good show because, language. And I said, you just have to understand that Roy Kent is the problem. And so they found themselves, at the end, they said, you didn't tell us that the bad guy was going to become one of our favorite characters. You didn't tell us that we weren't necessarily going to get a happy ending. You didn't tell us that there would be redemption for people we thought were irredeemable. And I'm like, huh, and welcome to why it's a Bible study. But that's just what I do. Uh,
Yeah.
and I am fortunate enough to I'm at one of the largest Lutheran congregations in my part of the state. I live in Iowa. I'm at a congregation that's about 3,000 members now. Um, I oversee our youth ministry, which is our ninth through 12th graders. And then I help do Sunday school for our 7th through 12th graders. So I see some of our middle school kids through that. But predominantly my focus gets to be just our high schoolers. So I get to focus in on what our high schoolers are thinking and doing and get to really tailor their ministry programs to their needs. So at the beginning of the year, I brought in one of those dry erase boards into our room and I said, tell me what you want to talk about.
Mm.
And so we got things like Star Wars and Harry Potter. We got things about some people say evolution isn't real. How do we talk about that? What do Lutherans think about sin? Um, what does our church define as a healthy relationship? Are some relationships sinful? Our neighboring church 2 blocks down sees the world in a radically different way than we do. Who's right? So we have conversations like that within our youth program. And our kids know that they're always welcome. We are a congregation that believes that everyone has a place here. That means our most conservative friends, our most liberal friends, everybody is welcome. Um, and that's really a testament to the culture of the folks in this community that everyone really does have a place here and there is space for everyone. We do a wide variety of groups that meet different needs. Some feed different people for different reasons. Um, and our kids get to see that directly reflected by who they're interacting with besides me here at church,
Mm.
that they're seeing folks who have different opinions or live different lifestyles than they have at their own home. And that they're understanding that we really believe that everybody has place. So, yeah, that's what I do. So, do you have more questions for me? I'm assuming you do.
Yes. One question that I was wondering. So, what made you fall so hard for Taylor?
So, for me, I was, oh gosh, about 25, maybe a little bit older when the VMA's incident happened.
Mm.
Taylor was 19.
Mm.
So maybe I was 24. I don't math well. Uh, and I remember it being everywhere on the TV that I was consuming. And where I lived and where I worked, I had like a 30-minute commute every day. And I oftentimes listened to a sports broadcast while I was driving that happened to be on through a local radio station. And they had a NFL football player from the Minnesota Vikings whose name was Jared Allen on every week on Tuesday mornings. And he was hot under the collar about something one day and he went off. And it was how absolutely unfair Kanye West was to a little girl. And that if Kanye West wanted to pick on somebody, he could pick on a grown man who would put him in his place. And how he said, if Kanye wants to have beef with somebody, he can have beef with me. You don't do that. She didn't rig the voting system, and you ruined her night. And he just went off in this sports radio program about this Taylor Swift thing. And I was like, Jared Allen is now my new favorite football player because he saw it as being unjust for it being a power differential. That
Mm.
Kanye at the time, wildly famous, wildly popular, and Taylor was still up and coming. I think that was just after Speak Now. I think I don't really know. I wasn't a huge fan back then, but I knew some of the big songs over the years, Shake It Off, stuff that would show up on my radio.
Hmm.
Um, I knew about kind of her continued lack of private life after the British tabloids really unfairly, when all of that stuff was going down with like them stalking William and Kate and Harry and Meghan, and Taylor got caught up in some of that.
Hmm.
That I remember thinking that it must really be awful to have everything you say or do be put under a microscope when you're not on the public's time clock. You're not touring, you're not doing a press junket, you're not talking on Good Morning America. You are walking with your boyfriend to get groceries.
Hmm.
And it was that continued invasion of the media and the paparazzi that made me go, oh, you're talking about now how that's infiltrating your personal life and how it's ruining your personal life because people can't respect that you want to keep something for yourself. And so that's when I really started to kind of notice more of like what she was talking about in her music.
Hmm.
Um, I also grew a little uncomfortable with the age differential in some of her relationships
Hmm.
because I was working in youth ministry at the time and I wanted to make sure that my students understood that if a 30-year-old is putting a lot of attention on you as a 16-year-old in our congregation, that's not okay. That a 22-year-old suddenly being very interested in who you're going to prom with is maybe not healthy.
Hmm.
And so I looked a little critically at some components of her life to use them as teaching moments for my kids of she's a working adult who lives in her own household. She's 19. She gets to do what she wants. But perhaps if a lot of people start asking the same questions, you might want to take a step back and look at why they're asking these questions. And we had discussions about predatory relationships and that how people treat you is a direct reflection of how they view you. That there will be people who treat you poorly because they view you as disposable. And those are hard conversations to have with 16-year-old girls who
Hmm.
suddenly really like the fact that an older guy is paying attention to them, who has his own truck and lives in his own apartment. And you're like, have we thought about why a 25-year-old is interested in your 16-year-old self? And so that was part of it. Another part was because my young adults were really into Taylor Swift and they wanted to learn more about football. And I love football. So I taught them a lot about what basic parts of the game are. What was really funny is I had already been listening to the Kelsey Brothers podcast.
Mm.
Um, a friend of mine had told me about Chris Long's podcast, who played with Jason Kelsey on the Eagles for a couple of years. So I'd started by listening to Chris Long's podcast, which then Jason went on Chris's podcast to launch their podcast and talked about how, he was getting into the podcasting world. And so I was like, well, this guy seems like goofy and a little bit of fun. And like he's very respectful about women, and that's not what I necessarily would have guessed from a guy who grew up in an interesting part of Ohio. Um, I equated him to having more of a meathead mentality and not a radical kindness mentality. And then I started listening to the podcast. I was like, oh, I'll learn a little more. And then I discovered that they were quite possibly two of the most kind and humble human beings in the NFL. And I was like, oh, and you still both call your mom mommy. And you like
Aw.
get into arguments over who's your parents' favorite kid. And you shame each other for your ridiculous stuff. Like, this is the most wholesome brotherly relationship And then you both talk about how this one dude from this one football team scares the pants off you and how you hate it when you have to both play him. And that this year it's going to happen to both of you. And neither of you want to face Sam Darnold. Or no, Aaron Donald. It was Aaron Donald that they were both like, we don't want to deal with Aaron. Um, and from there it was like, oh. And then, of course, the media went wild with the whole the salty man tried to give this woman a friendship bracelet. And it's like, no, it's probably the one guy in the NFL she should get a friendship bracelet from. And it worked out.
That is so precious.
And that's like from there, it became, well, I'll listen to the albums because you told me to. And then it became, well, I'm going to add some of these into my regular Spotify playlist. And then it became, oh, I didn't know this TV show used a couple of Taylor songs in their soundtracks.
Oh.
Um, where the Crawdads sing, Taylor had a song from that soundtrack. There was another one, another TV show that all of a sudden, like, there was a whole episode that had like three different Taylor Swift songs in it. That I was like, oh, she's really smart about where she puts her music. And
Hmm.
it's not necessarily in an obnoxious way, it's in a very organic storytelling format that her music fits in. I'm like, I like this. I like how she rolls. And then it became hearing more and more about how she really does quiet kindness and generosity. She doesn't make a big show about
Mm.
donations. She doesn't make a
Hmm.
big show about the radical generosity in every community that she puts a concert on in. Apparently, since like the Reputation tour, she's done very large checks to food banks in every city she plays in. That's a way that she's figured out that she can give back to those communities in a meaningful way, but she never talks about it. She's just
Yeah.
like, I just do things because I see that there are people in need. So I help.
Hmm.
Um, there was a big to do a couple weeks ago that she gave $5 million to the hurricane effort relief efforts in Florida. And I'm like, well, that makes a lot of sense. Her dad has a house in Florida.
Mm.
So does her boyfriend's mom.
Wow.
She's probably hearing firsthand from both of them
Hmm.
about a lot of the situations that are going on in Florida specific. And so she probably is like, yeah, I'll cut a check. I'm going to figure out some organizations that are doing a lot of really hard work and they're going to do the best to help people. So here's a check. Because money can't buy happiness, but money can sometimes fix a lot of problems.
Hmm.
And I think she is wise enough to have realized that she's got the capability to help give people life changing help, but doing it in ways that aren't making it about her.
Hmm.
It's that these people need help. I'm going to help them. I think that she, if perhaps the fan base wasn't at times a little over the top, would 100% be the type of person who would come in and literally help people do loads of laundry after a hurricane. She'd wash your
Aw.
towels. She'd walk your dog. She'd make sure your kids are entertained. She'd help figure out how to feed you all by just obnoxious amounts of baked goods. She would try to do, I think, things, but she also has to be mindful of the fact that where she goes, there are swarms. And those swarms require resources that would then divert resources from people who are in need. So I think that she's very mindful about making sure that I'm sure that before she went to Miami this week, she had a lot of conversations about making sure it wasn't taking away resources from hurricane ravaged parts of Florida and that being very careful to not exile people from the city who were in need of housing and things like that in the Miami area and making sure she wasn't displacing folks in need. And I think that's probably a testament to how her parents raised her.
Mm.
Um, she's mentioned before that she grew up going to church. I wouldn't be surprised if she grew up in a fairly mainline Protestant faith type community just based on how she acts, the words she speaks. She's very quiet about it, which tells me that it's probably a mainline denomination, just because of how she acts and her mannerisms. Just tell me, and I could be very wrong. She doesn't talk about her faith life a whole lot, and good for her because it's her personal life and she should get to keep it to herself.
Mm-hmm.
But that's how I got into it, which was um, I have somebody who's like blowing up my phone about apparently the Yankees game right now, of which I don't care about. Um, Travis Kelce probably cares very much because he is a Cleveland Guardians fan.
Oh,
But they're like, the Kelce brothers must be very happy right now. And I was like, oh, that means the Guardians must be up.
nice.
So, but yeah, that's how I got into it.
It sounds like your youth group's really been impacted by your Taylor comparisons.
So I have a group of ninth grade girls right now that are like, no joke, last night I was not prepared to have to talk about a One Directioner's death in my youth group because these kids, One Direction hasn't been a band since they were in kindergarten.
Yeah.
But two of them have aunts that were big One Direction fans
Mm.
that are in their 20s. And so like the audible gasp out of a corner of the youth room, and I was like, oh no, they just found out Liam Payne died. Now, I had gotten a text from another youth leader during our dinner portion of our Wednesday night that she was like, hey, just want to give you a heads up that One Direction guy Liam Payne died. And she's like, just in case you have to console any directioners.
Oh no.
But that's also like they know that I talk about music with my kids and I talk about
Yeah.
music with my young adults. And so my friend Bree was like, just a heads up.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, thank you, God bless, because it prepared me to have that conversation that I didn't think I was going to have.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so we talked about how we should never speculate about a situation when we don't know the details, and that very clearly we need to be mindful about the fact that he has a son who is 7. Some of them have younger siblings that are 7.
Wow.
Um, so then it became, how do we talk about this in a respectful manner that acknowledges that we don't know the full story about anything and we won't know the full story probably for weeks, maybe even months. This also happened in a foreign country. We got to take it for the media will go overboard immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And that talked about little bit about how do we distinguish fact from fiction in what we read on the internet, what we consume on TV, um, that every day there's a tabloid story that's true and every day there's a tabloid story that's false. How do we know the difference? Sometimes we don't. So that was a really interesting bit of discussion to get to have kind of before we got into our room of requirement actual
Mm-hmm.
Bible discussion that was planned. Because I took 10 minutes to deal with the situation that came up instead of just steamrolling and saying, well, we're not going to talk about that. Of course, we'll talk about it. If you're interested,
Yeah.
we'll talk. And then today I went and stood out at a cross country meet for one of my 8th graders to run in a circle and cheer. He didn't tell me he was good at it. He was just like, "Oh, you should roll up to the cross country meet tomorrow. It's at 3:30 at the community college course." Okay, my friend, I will roll up. Yeah, the kid got second place, and it was like 7 or 8 schools there. There were probably a good 7,500 kids running, and he got second place overall. And I was just like,
Wow.
I emailed his dad because I took some photos at it, and I emailed his dad. I was like, your child neglected to tell me he was like gonna be better than 90% of the kids in 3 counties. And then dad just cracked up and he goes, yeah, yeah. Turns out he's really good at running in a circle. But that was one of those things where kid rolled up and he's like, please come watch me run in a circle. Okay, my friend. And he was like, oh, you came. And I was like, yes. And I took good photos and I sent them to your dad. Because, like, your dad was standing in a place where he didn't get as good of photos. It's fine. That's what I do.
I love that so much.
I have had to be so many youth's Instagram photographer on so many youth trips. I took probably 100 pictures of my girls at the ocean last summer. We took
Hmm.
them from New Orleans over to Mississippi. I don't really know what the southern states and the Gulf Coast order is. I think it was Mississippi. I took them over. Um, some of my kids had never seen the ocean. So we went
Mm.
over, we spent about an hour at a beach. For some of my kids, that'll probably be the only time they ever get to go to the ocean.
Wow.
Um, we live in a very landlocked state. We live in Iowa. We don't have a lot of lakes. We don't have a lot of recreation water areas. So some of my kids may never see another sandy ocean beach again. So we went, and for an hour, I took so many Instagram photos because they're like, here, hold my phone, take this picture. And I'm like, okay, but I'll like pose you and like we'll wait till the clouds look cute behind you. And then I'll take 30 for you to pick the one that goes on your Instagram story. And then like one of them was like, look, I found a starfish. And then they put the sad starfish in my hand. And then I was like, we have to put it back. It's still alive. Put it back. Uh, but that's, and this is the same group of kids that then had a beignet eating contest 2 days later.
Wow.
That I'm like, I'm so glad that I don't have to explain any of this to your parents. Why is my child coated in white dust? It's powdered sugar. So much powdered sugar that they're all on sugar highs for the next 2.5 hours. So, any other good questions for me?
Yeah. Well, I think this will be our last one just for the sake of time.
Awesome. Sounds good. I'll go
So,
home and power up my sketchy live stream on TikTok and see who's live streaming about the Eras tour.
um, what would you say about sometimes the church's attitude on shunning or staying away from earthly things like you were kind of talking about earlier?
So, I am fortunate enough to be having been raised in, while it was a more conservative branch of the United Methodist Church, to be with enough great and gifted musicians specifically who viewed that God gave people talent and creativity and imaginations for a reason. And through the blending of those gifts, we get things like music, like books, movies. My parents were never the type of parents to forbid me from interacting with appropriate media. I wasn't watching slasher fix at 7, but they didn't view things as being forbidden for being inappropriate because it just wasn't about God or it wasn't about Jesus. It was, is the content appropriate for the age you are?
Hmm.
Um, they didn't care that I listened to Backstreet Boys and NSYNC. Um, I did have a Spice Girls CD banned from a road trip, but that's because my mother really didn't want to listen to Two Become One for a 19th time in a row. Uh, I had friends though that weren't allowed to listen to certain musicians. They weren't allowed to read books that their parents didn't approve of. I had some friends that weren't allowed to watch television. They grew up in much more conservative households. We went to the same church camps. Um, my parents grew up, my dad grew up in a very old school, rules focused household. My mom grew up in a household where her parents believed that the more diverse the community was, the better the community was. So
Mm.
her parents encouraged them to go to college when some of my mom's classmates still in the 70s didn't go to college. Um, my dad grew up in a town of 2,500 people where virtually no one ever left. And so they found a balance in how they raised their kids to be, we want our kids to uh, have an attitude of experiencing a multitude of things to figure out who they are and what they believe. We're not going to necessarily force our kids to believe the same things we believe, but we're going to support them in finding things that are the best fit for them. Um, None of my siblings or myself are still members of like the church my mom and dad went to. Um, Part of that is none of us live really close to home anymore. But I have a brother who joined a Baptist church and another brother who joined a non-denominational church. And now I work in the ELCA, which is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. We are the flavor of Lutheranism that ordains women and allows gay clergy, which is how I define it to people. There are other flavors of Lutheranism that have radically different rules. I belong to the branch where I, as a single adult woman, am allowed to teach kids about the Bible. I'm allowed to teach adults about the Bible. I'm allowed to do a lot of things. I just can't baptize kids. I can't preside over communion. Those are kind of the only two rules, and that's just because I'm not ordained. And I respect those rules 110%.
Hmm.
Because that also means I don't ever have to worry if the church furnace breaks. Because
Oh
I'm not
no.
the pastor. That is my boss's job. So yeah, I belong to a group of women that are exist on the internet. It's called Women in Youth Ministry. It's a great organization. And we have women from all flavors of the church, from Orthodox churches to super progressive communities of faith. We have folks who don't believe in secular music. We have folks who are talking about their Eras Tour costumes. Um, we're we're a very diverse group of people. Uh, Last summer, when I first kind of was populating this idea in mind of doing this kind of eras of the women of the Bible study, it came about because someone had said, hey, a bunch of my kids are keep listening to Taylor Swift music. Does anybody have any good resources for like talking about like music and faith and things like that? And another woman in the group went off about how it's witchcraft and you're going to hell for letting your children listen to secular music. And a huge number of us were like, one of the tenets of this group is that we focus on the positive. We don't argue about the things that are different in our beliefs.
Hmm.
And I have two really great friends in that community, Bree and Jennifer, who are both huge Swifties who've been part of my conversion process. And we all three work in radically different faith communities. Both of them work in more conservative churches than I do. One works in a church that doesn't ordain women. And there are things that we don't necessarily agree on. There are things that we love and respect about each other that overcome all of that. Um, and so I have compassion for the folks knowing that many people who believe that secular music is of the devil and things like that, that is the culture and the community they've been raised in. That's what they know. I do think that if we marinate ourselves in so much negativity and so much degrading statements, that it can affect how we outwardly see the world and how we convey ourselves to the public. then think that it's okay to treat other people as lesser, that we take stances of where we are better than other people. And that if we choose to only put ourselves in those environments, that's going to have a radical impact in who we are.
Hmm.
I'm fortunate that I was not raised in a community where certain music was wrong or bad. Now, I wasn't allowed to watch The Simpsons growing up until I was in high school. And my mom's rationale was she saw the behavior of Bart Simpson to be deplorable, and she didn't want me to think that was okay to how to behave. My older teenage brothers got to watch it at their friend's house. They weren't allowed to watch it in our house because I also was watching the TV. Um, I never had seen a single episode of the Family Guy TV show until I got to college for the same reasons. But yet at the same time, I knew every plot line of One Tree Hill. So I wasn't banned from much, but it was more, and my parents had active discussions about the why you're not allowed to pick up explicit rated music album that we don't know anything about the singer.
Hmm.
Um, but at the same time, my mom 100% bought me 8 Mile soundtrack when I was in high school because she went and saw the movie. And she was
Hmm.
like, okay, you can buy the 8 Mile soundtrack. Nothing about the music from that soundtrack is offensive for you to be able to listen to. So that was my foray into who was Eminem, was the 8 Mile soundtrack. And so I had that CD. And so that I think really is why I never villainize anything my kids interact with, but I do ask questions. Um, I had a student in California who was a big Travis Scott and Kanye West fan. And I had a conversation with him once about, would you treat your girlfriend the way Kanye West treats the women in his life? And he was like, no. And I said, then why do you find it enjoyable to listen to him speak that way about women? And then he talked to me about the songs he listens to of Kanye West are from like a decade ago. And I'm like, oh,
Ah.
you have a different Kanye West than the Kanye of now. Like, I now understand a little bit more about what you're listening to
Hmm.
because it's not present day, it is a decade ago. Still don't love it, but at least now I understand more.
Yeah.
Um, and so that too is I never treat my kids like they're a bad person for what they do interact with. I'll love it, but as long as they're not harming themselves or others, you do you, boo. So yeah, that's about what I got.
I love that answer. Thank you so much for like taking the time to talk to me about all this.
I am happy to. I think that our world is a better place when we share how our belief structure is and how we interact with the outside world.
Yeah, definitely.
So, well, you have a great rest of your night.
Hmm.